Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Bitcoin Mentor Q&A. As always, I'm Ed behind the Live Free BTC handle. We're joined here by Nathan on the Bitcoin Mentor handle. And our special guest speaker today is Stephan Livera. If at any point you'd like to come up and ask a question, join the conversation about Bitcoin, feel free to raise your hand and we'll have you up here. Stephan, thanks for coming and chatting with us today. How you doing?
Hey, yeah, no worries. Thanks for inviting.
Yeah, I'm a big fan
Stephan,
of your,
how is life in Dubai right now?
Yeah,
Yeah, things are going well. I think we're seeing a lot of people moving to Dubai, so it's actually becoming more. We're starting to see more traffic here, and starting to actually, just see more signs of people moving here. So yeah, it's interesting from that perspective. There's also the Bitcoin MENA conference that's in Abu Dhabi. That's coming up pretty soon. Otherwise, yeah, we've got our Bitcoin meetup that's on every month, and also an Austrian economics meetup. So yeah, it's pretty good so far. Actually, the Austrian economics meetup, some of the guys there went to watch. There's a Trump International Golf Course, so a bunch of us went to watch the election coverage there as well. So that was interesting.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's awesome. I'd love to get into the Dubai stuff because I've definitely seen a lot of people talking about it, and it seems like the jurisdiction is very like Bitcoin and just tax friendly, and it obviously ties into a lot of the Austrian economic stuff. And like I said, I'm a big fan of your podcast and some of the contributions you've had to the discussion around Austrian economics. And I'm actually kind of curious where you started with that. Like, when did you first like dig into Austrian economics and get into all that stuff?
Yeah, so when I was about 14, 15, I was on IRC, which is Internet Relay Chat. And so I would go on this politics channel. And while talking about politics in Australian politics, some guys in that channel kept linking Mises' daily articles. And so that was my first exposure to some of those ideas. Now, at first, I didn't really go with it, or I didn't really kind of get it. But after a while, it started to just make more sense to me. So yeah, that's actually kind of how I first got involved, or at least started, you know, learning a little bit. Because if you read these articles, obviously it's not like reading the full books, but you get like a little slightly watered down version, or just more like a condensed version of some of the books. And then later, as I grew up and aged a bit more, then I started actually reading some of the books, things like Man, Economy, and State, and Theory of Money and Credit, and some of these different books. So yeah, that was the main way I first got into it. And then yeah, just over time, it was just a viewpoint that made a lot more sense to me, and I started reading more about it, and like maybe watching some lectures and things like this over the years. As things like YouTube and things like that came up, then I would be able to watch some of those lectures also of some of these speakers and lecturers.
Oh, that's very cool. Stephan, while we're waiting for people to kind of file into the room here as well, too, I'm kind of curious if you can maybe, and feel free to go into as much detail as you're comfortable with, the decision to move to Dubai. I've had some recent conversations with people looking to go to other regions of the world. I'm curious kind of what prompted this, and then how you came to this decision and how it's been so far.
So for us, it was a few things. It was low taxes, it was safety, it was just the convenience in terms of travel. So it's a few things, but I would say I was invited to speak at a conference. Now, this is back in 2021. Tone Vase was organizing a thing. It was called Understanding Bitcoin. And so I went for that. And that was my first time in Dubai. And especially during the COVID tyranny years, it was a lot more open. So that was obviously a big positive for us. And so then basically come back to December of that year, my wife and I were thinking, well, yeah, actually we should try Dubai. And so it just kind of, a lot of things all came together, because I ended up meeting some of the people here in October of that year of 2021. And I think having that first exposure there of visiting, and people sort of saying, yeah, it's actually relatively open here, it's relatively good from a low tax perspective. So those things all kind of lined up, and that was kind of how it happened. So then in December 2021, we moved to Dubai. We sort of set up here, and we've been here since. So almost 3 years now.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's awesome to hear. It's nice to find stories of people escaping and finding better places elsewhere too. I think the sovereign individual thesis is something we're going to see more of. I was having a conversation actually this morning with a friend, and I'm really curious from the Austrian perspective, Stephan, your kind of views on this. We have Senator Lummis's bill that's going forward. We had Trump talking about the strategic reserve. We've got the Pennsylvania announcement as well too. And I was kind of curious, with government looking at potentially holding Bitcoin on their balance sheet, I'm curious if you have any just kind of initial thoughts on the implications of something like that. And then I'm also wondering if you have any thoughts on risks down the road with governments being major holders of Bitcoin. I know they have no impact on the network, but I'm trying to figure out how things might play out.
Yeah, so it's a few things. So I think from a libertarian perspective, you might have a slight conflict about that idea. I think in the short term, you could sort of maybe you could argue, okay, you don't want the government to be more powerful. But on the other hand, you could also argue in the longer term, it's effectively taking away their seigniorage rights, right? If they're participating in this thing, more and more people will adopt Bitcoin. And I think it's just going to all come around to more and more people opting into this monetary system where it's, it's they can't control the final supply, they can't remotely inflate it, they can't remotely confiscate Bitcoin. So there's a lot of advantages there. But on the other side, yeah, of course, you do have to also worry that it's not, it's not the be all end all. So one example would just be that people need to still make sure that Bitcoin remains decentralized, especially from a mining perspective, and that people are holding it themselves as much as possible. So those concerns are still there. I mean, I think with the U.S. government and with the Trump administration coming in, they're very pro crypto. So that's definitely signaling a big shift relative to the Biden Harris administration and their associated bureaucrats and people like that who are part of the system now. So I think it will be put it this way, you need to use the best technology for saving money, right? Like it's kind of the same way that Safety makes this point about the stock to flow. Now, stock to flow is a very important thing. It's not the only thing when it comes to money, but I think it's a very important thing, and that's the point that he makes. So I think it's that idea that you need to adopt the best money to save. You need to adopt this thing that the smart people are realizing, yeah, I need to save into this thing. And there might be some parallels with other technologies that maybe historically governments might not have been a fan of, say, VoIP technology, voice over IP. They might have seen it as a threat, but nowadays every government uses it, right? Nowadays, just everyone uses it because it would just be foolish not to, or even the internet or cryptography. And so, will governments regulate it? Yes. Now, I would rather they did not, of course, but realistically, yeah, I think governments will. Of course, there's things like AML, KYC, sanctions laws. These things apply at KYC and government. Let's say at businesses that are having to comply with the government. Obviously, I I disagree with the AML regime. I wish we could abolish all of that, but nevertheless, people are going to adopt Bitcoin, and I think yes, it's a pain having all these AML rules and things like that, but fundamentally, more and more people are going to adopt this thing because this is the way that you save in the modern economy, especially when you really think about the alternatives. If you think about the typical thing that most people are doing, which is buying stocks, buying bonds, or buying property, those are the typical things that people are using to save or to invest. And so a lot of people are just sort of buying these things without even knowing, because in various countries around the world, you might have some kind of, investment, retirement accounts. Money that you are earning is automatically being funneled into these retirement accounts. And then unbeknownst to many, average people, they don't really even know where their money is going. So in practice, it's going into like a target date fund or some kind of allocation that has something going into stocks and some going into bonds and some going into property, whatever. But Bitcoin has been absolutely killing all of those. If you were just invested in Bitcoin and you were hodling Bitcoin, you did something like, as I speak now, it's maybe 65 or 70% per year for 10 years. Now, do I think it's going to stay at that level? No, I think it's going to taper down over time. We should expect or anticipate diminishing returns over time is my intuition. But nevertheless, you're still absolutely way ahead of stocks and bonds and property, because we're just seeing this massive, let's say, evaporation effect, right? More and more people are going to realize that they're not actually making money in property or stocks and things like this. So I think all of these things are going to happen, and people are going to realize, and this is going to apply to you whether you are an individual, whether you're a small business, whether you're a family office, whether you're a fund, whether you're a public company, or whether you are a government or a state. So we're just going to see everyone, go towards this. It's just going to be a bit of time to recognize it. And in fairness, we see this cycle dynamic. So we could see more of these cycles come. None of us knows the future, but I could see it being likely in my mind that we see cycles continue out. And what happens if governments get wrecked on the next cycle, right? Or what if you're some big government buys the top of this, this bull run? It could happen, and then that during the next bear cycle, that could be kind of painful, and it might look bad. But at the same time, each new bear cycle brings in a whole round of new people who have realized, oh wait, what was I doing? Why was I buying all these random meme coins or whatever other things? Now I realize why I should be saving in Bitcoin. So that's sort of the dynamic we've seen historically. Will we see it play out again? I would guess, yeah. I think we are likely to see that again. But who knows, right? None of us knows.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree. I think that the cycles are going to continue, and it's just even as a matter of just information asymmetry. Tons of new participants who don't know what they hold and even necessarily why they were just attracted to NGU. Ed, it sounded like you had something to add there.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And I'm curious, Stefan, what your opinions are on like the game theory of Bitcoin playing out. You mentioned people investing in bonds and equities, and I mean real estate's a huge market too that I think is going to be affected by Bitcoin. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on maybe which one of those markets is going to be impacted more so, and which ones are going to be first. And I guess generally we could even go into, as we touched on earlier, how it's going to affect the game theory with governments. The states having to adopt it, and then having to adopt maybe a more prudent fiscal policy, like less spending, more responsible spending. Yeah, if you want to touch on any of those points, I'd be curious what your thoughts are.
So there's a lot of big governments that are in a lot of debt around the world. Many of them are really going to struggle to rein that spending in right now. Of course, if you're thinking in the US government context, there's now this Doge department with Elon and Vivek, who, they claim they're going to be able to cut a lot of spending out. I am, I'm hopeful, but I don't think that, I think it's going to be pretty hard. And I think even if they were to make big spending cuts, there's still going to be a lot of debt and a lot of problems in the US, especially if you look at things like Social Security and some of these entitlements and the spending. And this is a problem that's mirrored in much of the world. So I think it's going to get pretty rough and pretty messy out there. Some of the first markets that may be impacted here are bonds, because what might happen is there'll be a lot of people who are, let's say, more aware of the debasement that's going on. And so they may start to demand higher and higher yields. So I don't know exactly where that goes. I mean, I'm not like a macro crystal ball guy, but I think what we can maybe, if we zoom out and look at what the expectation should be, the expectation should be that there'll be a lot less people who just who want to buy bonds. And so I think that is going to drive a very different investment decision for a lot of people. So we may see people doing stocks and Bitcoin. So they might think of it like, okay, look, I think in their mind, they might think, okay, stocks are going to do better than some of these other things, and maybe a little bit of Bitcoin. Right now, that's probably a likely, if I'm guessing, I think that's a likely outcome. Of course, the more people in the know, they are going for a higher Bitcoin allocation. But I'm talking here about, people who are newer, maybe this is their first cycle. They may need to dip their toe in the water, so to speak, and take a small allocation of Bitcoin and then over time realize, oh no, I should have actually been taking a much larger allocation of Bitcoin. But everyone learns. Everyone, as the saying goes, everyone gets Bitcoin at the price they deserve, and so I think we'll see that play out over and over. In terms of dynamics between different governments, I think we're going to start seeing more and more governments get interested in stacking Bitcoin and hodling. We up until now we've seen governments such as El Salvador and Bhutan sort of more explicitly, or at least El Salvador explicitly doing it. Bhutan's case is more like they have been mining Bitcoin and it got doxed that they were doing that and that they were hodling a decent amount of Bitcoin, or a lot of Bitcoin relative to the size of their economy and the size of their population. But it seems where El Salvador is more like hardcore diamond hand hodler. That's the kind of the vibe you get out of El Salvador, and looking at what Bukele says and what the government there is doing. Whereas if you look at Bhutan, it looks more like they actually are willing to spend some of those sats to give their government employees a higher wage, as an example. So I think I saw an article recently talking about that. So we'll see what happens, right? It may be that they mined some coins and now they actually need to spend some of that, because obviously they spent electricity and they used up resources mining the coins. So I can understand why they might also see the need to spend some of it. Maybe they don't want to borrow against the coins, or maybe they can't access that, or I don't know why. But yeah, we'll see that. But yeah, will we see other countries try to stack sats? Yeah, I think we will. They will really, coming back to what I was saying before, though, is you really want to make sure they don't, they will want to make sure they don't buy the top of the next round. So, but yeah, none of us knows, none of us can predict. But I would say there are really opportune times to buy, and I think now is still a good time to buy if they are looking at it now. But typically what we see happen is people sort of get really interested in these things as the cycle is happening, as the price is running up. That's when you start to see more and more people getting interested in buying Bitcoin. And maybe that's when some of the hurdles start coming down in terms of institutional hurdles or governmental hurdles. Because often the process is that an individual needs to get orange pilled before that person is then able to go on and do it inside the organization that they're in, whether that's a public company or a government. And so that matters. And then also just kind of public sentiment, right? Like if public sentiment is very like, yeah, we save in Bitcoin, this is the thing you do, then it just becomes a lot more accepted. It's just part of the furniture, right? It's not a controversial thing. It's just everyone does it. Everyone uses the internet. Everyone uses, cryptography in some form as part of, when they use these chat apps and Signal and WhatsApp and whatever else, or banking apps online. It's all using cryptography in the background. So it's a similar kind of thing. When more and more people use Bitcoin, it's just going to be seen as it's just a standard thing.
I completely agree, and it's funny. I was having a wonderful conversation with Handsome Gary. I can see hanging out in the audience there this morning. But we even talked about how I think almost the psychological or kind of the Overton window implications of governments having strategic reserves might be even more powerful for overall adoption. Because I think one of the unfortunate lessons of COVID is that a lot of people, and I get it, we don't have time, right? You got to use heuristics. A lot of people are looking for authority to signal what is acceptable, what is good, what the right path to go down, how to behave. And I think that having even something, especially something like the U.S. government get involved, kind of throws that up like, yep, this is just normal, acceptable, and totally fine. The other aspect on that I'm kind of curious your thoughts on is just overall adoption. Well, I think that, and regulation, well, I think that the strategic reserve would be beneficial. I actually think something like de minimis amounts, like having no capital gains on de minimis amounts of Bitcoin, and allow it to be more of a freely, easily used medium of exchange, might be even more powerful for adoption. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Getting capital gains tax taken away is a great thing. Fully support it. Obviously, if you think back to even Austrian economics, right? There's this concept of sound money. What does sound money mean? There's two components to it. The first component is money chosen by the market, and secondly, It's money without impositions or impediments by the state. So obviously, having no capital gains tax that allows people to actually earn and spend in whatever they want is that's closer to the idea of sound money. And sound money, if you think about the way Mises spoke about it, it's that he saw it like a protection of civil rights, of human rights. That it's a way that the everyday people can protect their rights, as opposed to being forced to use a government coin that gets debased, as governments and politicians have historically done. And so, yeah, absolutely. Would it be great to have no capital gains on Bitcoin? Yeah, sure. I think it's more just about what's politically feasible, and will that happen? I don't know, but yeah, it'd be great if it does. I know there have been efforts on that. I know. I think Senator Lummis had a bill, something about a de minimis exemption. I don't know exactly where that's at, but it might just be sort of first get the Bitcoin reserve done, and then maybe they can go for that. I don't have any insight into exactly what's happening there, but yeah, I think also, I mean, if we're talking about what's most principled, I think the way Argentina did it was actually pretty good there, because they just said, yeah, you can do contracts in whatever you want, and so that part of it's interesting. But yeah, it just comes down to what's politically feasible, right? Because yeah, of course, I think having no capital gains tax is the principled, better approach. It's just about when or if it's politically feasible.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things that I've noticed is, with Trump obviously winning the election, he's kind of made been honest with his promises, I guess, to this point, with who he's been selecting for certain members of cabinet. And then you have, like Nathan was saying earlier, with Senator Lummis introducing that bill. Um, I'm I'm curious. That being said, he's also mentioned the strategic Bitcoin reserve, and on like news of his win in the election, I'm curious if other nation states are probably looking at this going, do we want to front run the United States potentially buying Bitcoin? And I think that there's a lot of, I don't know if there's a question in here, but maybe just like your thoughts on it. Like, do you think that, like, there's a possibility that we're seeing that happen right now, or we're going to see that happen? Maybe when he announces it, or if he announces it. I'm not saying that it's written in stone yet. He obviously has to get inaugurated and then actually do it. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there will be smaller and medium-sized states who are looking at this, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's certainly the rumors flying around, but yeah, I think there are other states looking at it. It's a question of how quickly can they move. I think it's difficult for large governments to turn on a dime, and I think that's also going to be a factor, because there may be some states where they don't have as much discretion to just go and do that, and that it takes time to get it through their legislation bodies and these kinds of things. So yeah, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm kind of on the same page there. I see we got Ben up here. Did you want to join, ask any questions that you had?
Yeah. Stefan, good to see you, buddy. I've got a question for you in regards to the hypothetical of if this does play out. There's a Bitcoin strategic reserve for the U.S. How do you see not only the game theory of that, but like the repercussions for the U.S. itself? Because the U.S. has been a major beneficiary of having that exorbitant privilege beings, even though it seems like, yes, we should do this. It's a huge benefit. Yes, comparatively, being earlier to having a strategic reserve is better than being later. But in the end, is the U.S. better off because of this? Because it still feels like they're
You're cutting out a bit, Ben.
Sorry, man, you're cutting out a little bit, but as I'm understanding, your question is about, is it how beneficial is it for the US to push Bitcoin adoption, given that the US already has the exorbitant privilege and the US dollar? Like, are they undercutting themselves? Is that the question you're asking?
I believe it is. Let's go with that.
Okay, well, I'm going to go with that as the question. I think a lot of people in the government and a lot of people who are kind of on the Bitcoin strategic reserve, maybe a lot of them haven't really accepted the full consequence of what hyper Bitcoinization implies. That maybe they see it like, look, most people are just going to, Bitcoin is just going to be the savings, and people are going to transact using the dollar or stable coins. And I will note as well, Trump also made an election promise about not having CBDCs. Like, I think he wanted to say that, and this was a thing in Republican circles where they wanted to ban CBDCs. So, I mean, that's a good thing from a liberty perspective. So, we'll see what exactly happens there. The skeptics might say, well, see, the stable coins are just going to be the CBDC, and they're just going to have surveillance on the stable coins. Maybe. Well, I mean, yeah, it is confirmed basically that in order to have a US dollar stablecoin, you probably have to allow a certain level of surveillance. Not that I like that, of course. Again, don't shoot the messenger, but that's probably the reality of it. So I think we're gonna, it's a while off until we actually see the full vision of people storing. Now, of course, the hardcores, people like us who store our net worth in Bitcoin and think about our net worth in Bitcoin terms, of course, we can do that. But a lot of people are not ready to go there yet. And it might be another, 15 or 20 years before it even gets there. So maybe they are undercutting themselves. But I guess the analogy I would make is it's kind of like how sometimes in life you got to disrupt yourself, right? It's like how Kodak and these people, they had like digital photography. And so maybe if you were intelligent, you could sort of see, okay, this is the way the wind is blowing, this is the way things are going. We can either jump in front of this and ride the wave or get crushed by it. And so yeah, we might, maybe, if you were going to be honest and long term about it, you might say, look, yes, long term the dollar's dominance is going to fade, but we've got to at least try and be leaders in Bitcoin. I think that's maybe the honest kind of long-term one way to frame it. It might be that. That said, in politics, I could understand where a lot of people see it like that they're not ready to countenance that, or they're not ready to kind of broach that subject. So they might sort of say, yeah, just dollar dominance, rah rah, everyone's going to use the dollar, and but we just want a strategic reserve anyway. And I could imagine them kind of holding that, a bunch of people holding that position, and maybe they're sort of they maybe not even intentionally Trojan horsing. They just genuinely don't see that possibility yet. Whereas, let's say a bunch of Bitcoin people do see that possibility of, yeah, long term, it is just going to be Bitcoin as the unit of account and paying for things denominated in Satoshis. So yeah, that's kind of how I'm seeing it for now. But yeah, I think, but I mean, here's why I think, our view kind of implies that, right? Like, if you believe it's best to hold the hardest money, and okay, the hardest money, it's not the only thing, but it's probably one of the most important things, the scarcity of money. If you believe that, then it kind of does imply long term that, yeah, everything is going to be denominated in sats. And so it kind of implies that you would rather go that way. How soon the rest of the world wakes up to that, who knows?
Just to even yes and your point there, Stephan, too, I think even we could see in the short term, and this kind of goes to Brett Johnson's dollar milkshake theory, that I would not be surprised to see relative to other fiat currencies, both Bitcoin and the US dollar rising. Again, there's that information asymmetry. And as the rest of the world kind of moves away from their faster failing fiat, you'd see capital flight likely to the US as maybe being an ideal jurisdiction. And it already has the existing network for commerce as well, too, at the same time as Bitcoin's just ripping. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Sorry, repeat the question again. I didn't, if you could just repeat that for me, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I can kind of envision a scenario, and this is based on stuff that I've heard from Brett Johnson and his dollar milkshake kind of theory. Now, he speaks about it in terms of gold and the US dollar going up at the same time. Yeah. And I kind of see that same thing applying to Bitcoin, where essentially it's the other currencies that will fail first. And as a result, purchasing power is going to go into hard assets and the US dollar.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that is likely to happen. Of course, Brent is not as hot on Bitcoin as we are, so he sees it like it's going to gold. I obviously disagree with him on that. That said, I mean, no, I hold 0 gold, but I think it's probably a fair prediction to think gold is going to rise over the next 10 years. It's just that I think Bitcoin is going to absolutely clobber gold, right? So I think, we're probably going to see gold rise. We'll probably see stocks rise. Real estate will rise, but maybe not, as much. But Bitcoin is still going to outclass all of them over the next 10 years. That's kind of my broader view. So, yeah, I could see that. I could see weaker fiat currencies folding and people just using the dollar. And I could see places, various countries around the world. I could imagine some of them just going and using dollar denominated instruments, whether that's stable coins or fiat banking, things like this. And I'll note as well that there are some countries around the world that are already pegged. Some countries already do use some kind of pegging system to the dollar. So that already exists to a limited extent, but we may see more do that. And what we've seen, as probably many of you know, what happens in some of the basket case economies is that they dollarize, right? The Venezuelas and the Zimbabwe's of the world, as they start to go bad from a monetary perspective, you see a lot of them dollarize. And so that's what we saw in Argentina, or have heard in Argentina and Turkey and places in Lebanon and places like this, where, as an example, I know in Argentina, they quote the house prices in US dollar terms. They don't even bother quoting things in Argentinian peso terms. So, yeah, we could see that. But yeah, I think what is likely to play out is Bitcoin is a superior monetary asset and technology to what gold is. And so I anticipate that more and more people will start to realize that. And a lot of gold bugs are going to be a bit upset about that, because in their view, it's like Bitcoin's eating their lunch, because they saw like, all those gains should have come to gold. But I think in the end, it's coming to Bitcoin. And so for the short and medium term, I see gold rising, just not as much as Bitcoin.
Yeah, no,
I completely agree.
Yeah, I could definitely see that
Go ahead,
too.
Ed.
Yeah. So I'm actually curious then, because we're talking about like a lot of the other national like fiat currencies probably pivoting to a dollar. What your thoughts are on CBDCs that we're seeing being like either like piloted by other countries. Um, Obviously the stablecoin issue, I think, lends a lot of there's a good amount of credibility that we could assume that they'll just maybe like El Salvador uses dollars, right? A small country wants dollar exposure, just adopts maybe like a stable coin usage, and how that might affect just like that'll play out, right? Like as like all these smaller fiat currencies start to die out, maybe they start adopting stable coins or like a new version of a CBDC, and then like in my opinion, I think we're transitioning in the long run to Bitcoin only. Everything's just going to use Bitcoin. Bitcoin will eventually demonetize the dollar itself. But where do you see that like transition happening?
So absolutely, CBDCs are a threat, and they're coming around the world, and they're already in trial in many different countries. We're seeing this. So they're coming. I think let's say the saving grace for now is that a lot of the everyday people actually don't like CBDCs. They don't want CBDCs. But I think it'll be similar to the COVID tyranny, where maybe at the start people were against lockdowns, but then later, because of the fear and the propaganda, then they want lockdowns, or they wanted lockdowns. All right. So again, not endorsing, just trying to call it how I think is likely to happen. I could see a scenario where they try to whip up enough fear in the people to get them to accept a CBDC. Or the other way that it could be done is it's kind of like it's the carrot. They may say, look, if you want welfare, it's going to come in CBDC, and it's going to be geo-blocked or geo-located or geo-targeted, so that you can only spend it in this particular area on X, Y, and Z goods. And so that's the threat longer term. And so they may try to sort of put some lipstick on a pig. They may try to do certain things. They may try to say things like, oh, look, don't worry, plebs. Use our little CBDC, and you'll get maybe some limited forms of privacy. And they may try to, use that as a selling point to people. but maybe on the back end, the government can still see, but maybe it's just the merchant doesn't see, or they'll try to sell it to people in certain ways. Historically, the typical ways are, we need to do this to stop the terrorists, or we need to do this to protect the children, right? Those are kind of the classic excuses that governments and politicians will use. So that may be what happens with CBDCs. We'll see. But also at the same time, I think there will be surveillance on stablecoins too. And, we already see that already exists. I think you have to be realistic, but also push for liberty improvements wherever you can. And so there are times where you have to kind of accept an imperfect step forward. And so that's where things are at. I think if you kind of get too strictly ideological about things, then I think you end up not having any impact at all. And so I think there's kind of a principled pragmatism, let's say, that is there in that sense, that we can talk about, crypto anarchy and anarcho-capitalism and all these ideas, but at the same time, we live in the real world with, depending where you live, politicians or monarchs who are the ultimate, sovereigns, or who are the ultimate people who decide what happens. Of course, we should do what we can to try to, influence and push things in a liberty direction, but there's only so much we can realistically do.
Yeah, I
I
agree with
agree.
that. Sorry, yeah.
Ben, I can see that you have your hand up.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Got you good?
Yep,
Yeah,
gotcha.
sounds
Go
good.
on.
Awesome. Sorry if I cut out a little bit, but I just was wondering about a commentary in and around how the CBDC versus Bitcoin reality may contribute to further gaps in, like, the wealth gap specifically, in that the productive people will gladly accept Bitcoin for what they do, and they likely will shy away from the whole CBDC thing. And so primarily the people dealing with the CBDCs, which of course will continue to be money printer go burr digitally, that will primarily be, again, as Stephan alluded to, paid out in welfare and UBI and all this stuff. So the lower classes of society that are decidedly perhaps unproductive would be exclusively paid in the debased currency, and the people that are most productive are not only going to be paid in Bitcoin but storing their wealth in it. So I'm curious what you think about the growing wealth divide and the rifts that may cause in society, just in terms of, again, like a 99% style feeling amongst society when they're confused about what's actually shaking out.
Yeah, so I think a lot of this is, in the recent years, there's been a lot of conversation about UBI, MMT. What is the mechanism? How is it going to work? I share some of this concern that, we're going to see this come in the next 10, 15 years as this kind of plays out. Yeah, I think there will be a divide of the haves and the have-nots, and that's going to cause some social problems. There's going to be some social and cultural problems that are created by that, because there'll be a lot of people who sense that, hey, this isn't fair or this isn't just, but unfortunately the damage has already been done, right? Like, there's a lot of these cases where, there's just going to have to be some liquidation of certain businesses, certain business models. And what I think may throw somewhat of a spanner in the works there is if there's maybe a bit more of a rightward shift to what we've seen, like as an example with like Trump and Millet, and I don't know, maybe in Canada, if Pierre gets in, I've seen he's like 90% chance of getting in. There may be somewhat of a rightward shift, and maybe there'll be a sense in which they might try to sort of right the ship a little bit, because maybe things have been going kind of crazy for a while. And so we might see efforts made there, but I think fundamentally it's still going to be this haves and have-nots dynamic. And so, it's going to, I think there'll be different movements in terms of people trying to let's say, like trying to right the ship, and then there'll be other people who are like, hey, I'd rather just go somewhere else and play the flag theory game. So, I think those will be the two main options, right? It's either quote unquote stay and fight or flag theory and go somewhere else. And so, but I mean, let me try to answer your specific question though, which was about CBDCs and kind of what that means in a Bitcoinized world. I think there will probably still be people who do CBDC deals for Bitcoin. As an example, there might be like OTC or kind of peer to peer. I know it sounds kind of dumb, but yeah, I mean, in the same way that like you saw that tracker of like the stimmy tracker, right? Like if you remember during the COVID tyranny years, there was that government stimmy amount, and then there was like that tracker saying, yeah, if you just bought Bitcoin with your stimmy check, what would it be now? And so there's things like that. So not everyone can save, right? So I'm trying to be sensitive to that, right? Because some people are not earning enough that they can actually save. But everyone who can should try to save into Bitcoin. That's how I see it, and I think if you try to live within your means, and then we may see people who do peer-to-peer deals using CBDC, right? Like if we're all forced into it, if depending on exactly how things play out, right? Because I think this is one thing where I see a bunch of Bitcoin people online signaling, because sometimes online is kind of like people want to have a competition about how hardcore they are or how much they hate CBDCs. I think it might be forced onto people without really having much choice. And unless you are willing to pick up and leave, right? And not everyone's ready to do that. Unless you're willing to pick up and leave, you may be in a situation where you're forced to use CBDC, right? Because, we've all got bills to pay. We all have to either, you either own your home or you're paying rent or you're paying a mortgage. And you have to, even if you own your home, you're still paying bills and you're still paying for these things. What if the government forced you to use CBDC for that? Well, then, we would be in an environment where maybe, of course, we've got our Bitcoin hodlings and our savings off to the side. But in terms of interacting with the fiat economy, you might have to use the CBDC. So we'll see what exactly happens there, depending which country. But I think we'll just see people using, as silly as it sounds, there'll be CBDC deals done for Bitcoin, right? People might say, okay, I'm going to pay you this amount in fiat CBDC and you pay me in Bitcoin for this other thing or whatever. We might see that happen. So it will be obviously it will be highly, highly surveilled and controlled, but so is our fiat system today. It's just that it's going to be more centralized. Government will have more monetary control. They may be able to do things like negative interest rates potentially in the future. They may be able to control where and how you spend it. But what's that Jurassic Park saying? It's like life finds a way, right? Maybe it's kind of like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Ben, did you have anything you wanted to add to what he was just saying on your question?
No, I think that's probably a pretty accurate depiction of what's going to happen.
Mhm.
Again, and as Stephan alluded to, I think people will again find a way to swap between CBDCs and Bitcoin, right? Like there's if there's any ability to like give money to somebody with a CBDC, then there'll be ability to have a secondary market that doesn't explicitly link the movement of a CBDC to Bitcoin. Again, like we have the hodls of the world where it's you just as long as you can link up two people, you can make it happen.
Yeah, exactly. So I understand that it may be, let's say, unsavory or not, but I'm saying this in a don't shoot the messenger sense, right? I think that's the likely way things are going to go. And so, try to be ready for that and try to understand that there'll be people who are not ready to kind of come to Bitcoin yet. So, there's going to be that. And, there may be even, it depends on how things work. There may be wallets that kind of act across both, right? That kind of let you have a balance across both. Or it might be more segregated systems where, somebody has spare CBDC coins, and let's say Ben needs to pay his utility bill with CBDC coins, then he might do a deal to swap some Bitcoin for that. And it'll just be not that distinct from how, let's say, like a hodl works today, something like that.
Yeah, and I think that one of the beautiful things about Bitcoin is that it's completely permissionless, right? So even if you are forced into using a CBDC for maybe paying your property tax or those things that you really just can't avoid and are mandated, nothing's stopping you from getting paid through your labor or through goods and services that you provide yourself in Bitcoin, right? So there's always going to be that option for people to kind of skirt that system and avoid it. But I definitely think that, even the hardcore Bitcoiners are in some jurisdictions going to be forced to partially participate in these CBDC systems. And obviously, while you're not, I think it's good to oppose it. And like, the politicians, if you're, if they're willing to listen, if there's one of them, even just one in your local government, to let them know that you don't like it. And I think that, like I said, there are a lot of people that are against it. But I do want to just quickly mention that anyone in the audience, if you want to ask a question or join the conversation, feel free to raise your hand. Um, Nathan, I see you came back. Did you want to add anything to the conversation there?
Nope, I was having technical issues, so I'll just let you guys continue for a second while I get caught up on where we're at.
Yeah, all good. All good. So, Stefan, while we're getting close to the top of the hour, I'm curious if you have any maybe projects you're working on or future developments that you'd like to share with us. I'm curious, like maybe things regarding your podcast or anything you'd like to share.
No, I mean, that's mainly it, just podcasting and doing some occasional writing here and there. So, that's probably what I'll be doing over the next year or so. Of course, I'll be attending a few different events here and there, speaking at events and things like that. But yeah, just kind of keeping an eye on what's happening and seeing what's interesting, what topics are, what topics that I think are interesting or educational for the community, whether that's, Bitcoin development stuff or lightning things or conversations about where things are going on the next soft fork or things like that. I think those are, that's pretty much where it's at.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious. Are there any things in particular that are piquing your attention right now? Maybe like
Well, I
the
think
Bitcoin stuff.
the soft fork conversation seems to come back up, and sometimes we see debates there as well about who controls Bitcoin, who controls what gets merged. How is it truly a meritocracy, or is there or is there kind of like a clique? I don't know. Some of these debates seem to come up, and then kind of the debate about kind of the ossify versus improvements further. And then, of course, even if you don't want any feature improvements, at the bare minimum, we need bug fixes and maintenance. And I think this is something a lot of people aren't really quite clear on, because let me put it this way: I think when someone is newer to Bitcoin, they sort of come into it and they might have heard different podcasts and things, and they might have been given this impression of, oh, Bitcoin is this pristine thing and so on. And I'm sure many of you have heard that idea. But actually, no, hang on, there were inflation bugs, right? Like in 2010 or 2011, I think there was this infamous value overflow era where it was like 80 billion Bitcoins were mined. Now, of course, this is before Bitcoin had a price, so it got changed. And then in 2018, there was another inflation bug, not exploited, but there was an inflation bug. And so, I think people have to, as you sort of learn more about Bitcoin, then you sort of have to learn more about some of the plumbing and what's required to keep it, secure. And that requires bug fixes. And so, for example, I think a lot of people might not really be aware, but there's this concept known as the consensus cleanup. And so these are certain long-standing bugs that actually require a soft fork to fix. So just kind of quickly, one is that it's known as the time warp bug, and there's another one relating to blocks that could take a long time to validate. And so this could maybe, if somebody maliciously crafts a transaction or a block, they might be able to take some nodes off the network, or maybe DOS those nodes by making them spend a lot of time computing to try to verify that block. And so these are some things that could potentially be fixed with a consensus cleanup. So there's still work being done on this, right? It's not like ready to go now, but it's one of those things that I think people need to be aware of that. And let's see, maybe that could be the next soft fork to kind of do, because it's a bug fix, not necessarily adding new features or anything. And then, we'll see what the community is open to after that.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that it is important to point out that like most of the features that we want out of Bitcoin are there, right? Like it is I guess you could say like a finished product in that sense. Like we have most of the things we need. We're gonna obviously have some incremental updates, but that doesn't mean we should stop supporting the contributors to the project. And there's a lot that goes into the security of it, and I'm glad there are people out there doing this. Whether they're unpaid or paid. These people are doing a lot of work for this community of people. I mean, it's a almost $2 trillion asset, right? And there's people that are, essentially just working for free to help support it. So I mean, maybe a thankless job, but nonetheless very important. Ben, I see you've had your hand up for a while, so I want you to join in there.
Yeah, and along the same general thread of Stephan, your personal interests and stuff like that. Obviously, I lean on the side of educating about like some of the tools and wallets and stuff. I'm curious what some of the wallets or nodes or hardware or what kind of stuff is in your arsenal currently, and if has anything changed as of late. What are you using these days?
Yeah, so mainly Sparrow. I think Sparrow is a really great tool. Of course, I'm sponsored by Cold Card, so I love using my Cold Card, and of course the Q device as well. And yeah, so those are probably, and then I use Phoenix as kind of my, as one of my Lightning wallets. But I also have my own Zeus like LND set up as well. So I guess those are kind of my, let's say, my daily drivers or my main kind of things. Of course, like my cold storage, I use like multi-sig for that and different locations and things like that. So, but of course, in terms of my regular sort of day to day, yeah, more like Phoenix or Zeus as my kind of, if I'm, doing Lightning and things like that. Yeah, but I think it'll be interesting to see what comes up next. I mean, there's so many things. It's such a wild space. There's always things happening, right? Like Miniscript is an important, a new thing that might really improve things in terms of how we do our multi-sig and but also have redundancy and backups at the same time, or handle inheritance. So that might be an interesting. And then, of course, things like those multi-layer or things like an Aqua or things like a, Stash Pay or a Blitz wallet. These things are also going to be interesting going forward because, yeah, if we see a lot of on-chain use, then maybe people will need to kind of offload things to other layers, right? Whether that's, um, or other layers or other, things like Liquid. So yeah, we'll see what happens exactly there, but that might be useful, or even some of these wallets that kind of also do, as you know, like a mix of things, whether they can kind of do eCash, but also do Lightning and Liquid and on-chain Bitcoin, and where does that all blend out to? Now that, in fairness, some of that is more at a, let's say, transactional level. Whereas obviously the hodling stuff is kind of more about multi-sig and air gapping and hardware devices and things like that, where that's where maybe the Sparrow or the Nunchuck or Electrum and these kinds of things come into it. So those are some things I'm kind of watching. So yeah, just kind of interested to see where it all goes there, because yeah, it's very hard to predict exactly. Will it be one wallet to rule them all, or is it more like you use individual tools for different things, and maybe you've got your cold storage set up that's multi-sig and different locations and all this and more advanced things, and then a more easy on the go, simple Lightning or custodial thing that handles the kind of day-to-day earning and spending sort of aspects. So yeah, it's kind of, there's so many different tools, whether that's using BTC Pay, which I also have. I have a BTC Pay. So there's just so many different tools. It's really it's just difficult to kind of simply simplify that down in some ways, right? Because there's so many different options, and you have to try to stay up to date on those to be able to advise people who are new, so that you can pick the, as the saying goes, pick the right tool for the job.
Yeah, I completely agree. Ben, I'm curious your thoughts on that.
I mean, you just mentioned a bunch of things that I love and use myself. So I think we're pretty much in line with some of the tools we're using.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting. I mean, we'll see what happens. Like, I'll give another example, something that might make sense. Like, let's say you've got a noob friend. Like even in Dubai, there are some guys here who maybe they're not that tech savvy, or maybe they don't have a laptop, right? Because they, obviously people like you and I and us, we probably just kind of take it for granted that everyone has a desktop and a laptop and they can use Sparrow and things like that. But for them, if they literally don't even use a laptop or a desktop, then it's like, what do you recommend for them? Okay, so then I'm starting to think, okay, well then maybe get a Cold Card Q and get a Nunchuck on your mobile phone, and then you can just use the QR code feature there. Like that's an example of something you could do as a self-custody setup there. So we might see more development down that pathway. Who knows? Or like NFC being used in the case of like multi-sig setups, right? Like if you're doing multi-sig setup, but you need to do that thing where you that register the quorum step, right? Where, if you're using SD card, that can kind of require kind of fiddling around with the different menus. And, I guess guys like us who've been around for a while, if we've kind of used the different hardware wallets and we've played around with multi-sig on different apps and we're sort of more familiar with it. But somebody who's newer to this, like it might just be, like it's like you're learning a whole new language, right? And then thinking about, okay, am I dealing with this with NFC, or am I doing SD card for that one, or am I doing QR codes back and forth for that one? It could be very, or am I plugging it in with a USB? Like this is so many different configuration options, and sometimes it's like a paradox, right? When there's so many options, people get paralyzed. They don't know what to do because there's just so many different possible ways they could go, and that's where having some guidance, or having people put out, let's say, recommendations on, okay, if you're trying to do cold storage and you're new, okay, maybe start with this particular device and start with this particular app to pair it with, and then as you advance up, now there are other apps that might be useful for you and that you should consider.
Yeah, I completely agree. Even just go ahead, Ben.
I was going to say, I like the language analogy. The only difference would be it's like learning a new language, but if you mispronounce a word, you lose your life savings.
Yeah, unfortunately. Oh, damn. Yeah, I mean, that's really, it's kind of brutal, but true. That's why for me, it's so important to do testing and recovery, right? Like, especially in the wild years, you just have to like make sure you do testing and recovery, and not just testing and recovery at the start, but kind of ongoing testing and recovery to make sure your devices are still working, and these aspects of it. So yeah, it is. It's still early days, but yeah, hopefully it gets better. And there are, I think one thing I notice as well. I've written guides and tried to help people, but the thing I just find is, you sort of take the time to write a guide or make a video, and then 6 months later or 12 months later, it's out of date. There's like a new thing that you need to think about, or it's just kind of, maybe it's not the optimal way to do it. And then I'm sure, well, obviously, Ben, you do this kind of as your, job, and that's your main focus. So I guess you're obviously very familiar with that, but let's say for someone like me, where obviously I'm mainly podcasting and doing some articles, when I'm sort of trying to make a guide, it's kind of, yeah, it's like a whole new, it's not my, let's say it's not my main specialty nowadays, so it's kind of, it takes a bit more to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an ongoing.
Thank you, Stephan.
Yeah, it's an ongoing process, 100%, even for people that are in the Bitcoin space and maybe giving advice to newbies. Like you have to constantly be learning things, and it's almost getting to the point where the Bitcoin ecosystem and like all the technology and wallets are, so there's so many of them that it's impossible to know everything. It's just gotten to that point. But I really appreciate you spending the time and talking to us, and I want to be respectful of it. So as we wrap up the space, I'm just curious, if people want to find out what you do and learn more. Maybe a link to your podcast. Where can they find you?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as you said, I have my podcast. People can find that stephanlivera.com. Of course, follow me on social media, and I'm on Nostra as well, and YouTube and Spotify and all the places. And then, my podcast is a good way for people to stay up to date on what's going on. Many people in the space themselves are listeners of my show because they want to keep up to date on what's happening, whether that's technology things or economic things. And so, yeah, I would just recommend people who want to stay up to date, check out my podcast, stephanlivera.com. And yeah, thanks guys for hosting me.
Absolutely, yeah, and definitely echo that. Go check out the podcast. I'm a big fan of it, and a lot of the great conversations you've had on there. And like I said, again, really appreciate it. Make sure you give Stephan a follow. You could also give Ben up here a follow. Thanks for coming and joining the conversation today, Ben. And if you want to give me and the Bitcoin Mentor handle a follow, you can stay up to date with when we run the space every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern time. We work with Bitcoin Mentor, and you can learn more at bitcoinmentor.io. You could book a free one-on-one session with us, email one of us, and we can get you started on your Bitcoin journey or help you along. Anything from self-custodying your Bitcoin, running a node, multi-sig, anything you have a question about, we'll be there to help you. But I hope everyone has a great day, and we'll be back on Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern to talk again. Take care, guys.
Awesome. So thank you so much, guys.
Later.